The digital clock on Emma's nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. in bright red numbers. For the third time that week, the 3-year-old girl sat upright in her bed, her small body trembling violently as sweat dripped down her pale forehead. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, her mouth open in a silent scream that finally erupted into a desperate, heart-wrenching cry. "No, no, no, Mommy! Mommy, help him! Please help him!" The words came out in broken, panicked shrieks that echoed through the quiet house in suburban Denver, Colorado. Susan Chen, Emma's mother, jolted awake instantly, her maternal instincts kicking into overdrive. She kicked off her blankets and sprinted down the hallway to her daughter's room, her feet slapping against the hardwood floor. When she burst through the door, she found Emma sitting straight up in bed, her pink nightgown soaked through with perspiration, her golden curls plastered to her tear-stained cheeks. The little girl's blue eyes were wide and wild with terror, unseeing, still trapped in whatever nightmare had seized her sleeping mind. "Emma, baby, I'm here, Mommy's here." Susan rushed to the bed and scooped her trembling daughter into her arms, pressing Emma's face against her chest. She rocked her back and forth, whispering soothing words, but Emma continued to sob uncontrollably, her entire small body shaking like a leaf in a violent storm. The doggy is crying, Mommy. He's so cold, he's so scared. Nobody is helping him, nobody listens." Emma's words tumbled out in a desperate rush, her 3-year-old vocabulary struggling to express the profound trauma embedded in her subconscious. Susan's heart broke into 1,000 pieces as she held her daughter. She knew exactly what Emma was talking about. 2 months ago, Emma had witnessed something that no child should ever have to see, something that had stolen her peaceful sleep and replaced it with nightly horrors. It had started innocently enough on a warm afternoon in late September. Emma had been playing in their backyard, building a sandcastle near the wooden fence that separated their property from their neighbors. That's when she heard it, a sound that would haunt her forever, the agonized whimpering of an animal in distress. Being a naturally curious and compassionate child, Emma had immediately toddled over to the fence and peered through a crack in the wooden planks. What she saw would be burned into her memory forever. There, chained to a post in the scorching sun, was a golden Labrador retriever named Shadow. But this wasn't a healthy, well-loved dog. Shadow was skeletal, his ribs protruding so dramatically that they looked like they might pierce through his matted, filthy fur. His coat, which should have been gleaming and golden, was instead a dull, grayish-brown color, caked with dirt and what looked like feces. The dog had no shelter from the blazing sun, no water bowl, no food dish. His chain was so short that he could barely move more than a few feet in any direction. But the worst part, the part that had embedded itself in Emma's young psyche, was Shadow's eyes. They were hollow, desperate, filled with a depth of suffering and confusion that a 3-year-old could understand on an instinctive level. The dog had looked directly at Emma with those heartbreaking eyes, as if silently pleading, "Please help me. Please make this stop." Shadow had whimpered pathetically, and Emma had stood there, frozen, tears streaming down her face, unable to comprehend why anyone would treat a living creature so cruelly. Emma had run back inside and told her mother everything she had seen. Susan had immediately called the police, reported the animal abuse, and demanded that animal control be dispatched immediately. The police had arrived the next day, but frustratingly, they had only issued a warning to the neighbor, a man named David Peterson. Peterson had claimed he was training the dog and that Shadow would be fine. The police officer had left without removing the dog or filing charges, saying that while the conditions weren't ideal, there wasn't enough legal evidence to constituting criminal animal cruelty. Yet, that had been 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks of Emma watching Shadow's condition deteriorate. 8 weeks of the little girl losing sleep, developing anxiety, and having increasingly severe nightmares. Susan had taken Emma to see a child psychologist, Dr. Patricia Morrison, who had diagnosed her with what she called secondary trauma, trauma caused by witnessing suffering rather than experiencing it directly. Dr. Morrison had warned Susan that if the situation with Shadow wasn't resolved soon, Emma's psychological condition could worsen significantly. As Emma cried in her mother's arms that night at 3:17 a.m., Susan made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for the legal system to move at a snail's pace. She wasn't going to let her daughter continue to suffer while that poor dog deteriorated in the backyard next door. She had been researching her options, and she had found a lawyer, a passionate animal rights attorney named David Rothstein, who specialized in animal cruelty cases. Rothstein had told her that if they could gather enough evidence and witness testimony, they could potentially press charges that would actually stick. Emma's crying eventually subsided into quiet whimpers, and Susan carried her to her own bed, letting the child sleep between her and her husband, Tom. As Emma finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, her small hand gripping her mother's shirt, Susan stared at the ceiling in the darkness, her mind racing. Tomorrow, she would call attorney Rothstein and tell him they were ready to move forward. She would ask him about the legal process, about what would be required of Emma, about whether her daughter would have to testify in court. The thought made Susan's stomach turn. Emma was so small, so sensitive, so young. Could she really handle being questioned in a courtroom? Would the stress of legal proceedings make her trauma worse? But then Susan thought about Shadow, about those desperate eyes, about the fact that without Emma's testimony, that dog would probably die in that backyard, alone and suffering. As dawn began to break over Denver, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Susan made her final decision. Emma would have to testify. It would be difficult, it would be frightening, it would require incredible courage from a tiny 3-year-old girl. But it was necessary, because Shadow deserved justice, and Emma, despite her age and vulnerability, was the only one who could provide it. The legal battle that would follow would test every ounce of strength both mother and daughter possessed. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Chen family home as Susan stood in Emma's doorway, watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. It was Tuesday, November 14th, the day of the trial. Emma's small body was curled into a ball, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her breathing soft and even. Susan felt a pang of guilt wash over her. Should she really put this innocent child through what was about to come? But then she thought of Shadow, of those hollow eyes, and she steeled her resolve. "Emma, baby, wake up," Susan whispered softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. She gently brushed a golden curl away from her daughter's forehead. "Today's a special day, remember. You get to be very brave." Emma's eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she looked peaceful, unburdened. Then reality crashed back in, and her small face crumpled with anxiety. "Mommy, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if the bad man gets mad at me? What if nobody believes me?" Susan pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, breathing in the sweet baby shampoo scent of her hair. "Nobody is going to be mad at you, sweetheart, and everyone is going to believe you because you're going to tell the truth. The truth is the most powerful thing in the whole world." She paused, then added with careful optimism, "And guess what? There's going to be someone very special there to help you, someone amazing." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "Who?" "It's a surprise," Susan said with a small smile. "But I promise you, when you see him, you're going to feel so much braver." The drive to the courthouse took 30 minutes. Emma sat in her car seat in the back, wearing a pink dress with white lace trim that her grandmother had bought her for special occasions. Her small feet swung nervously beneath her, barely reaching the seat cushion. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, whom she had named Mr. Flopsy, so tightly that the fabric was beginning to tear at the seams. The city of Denver rolled past the car windows. Tall buildings, busy streets, people rushing about their daily lives, completely unaware that in a few hours, a small girl would change everything. Susan kept glancing at her daughter in the rearview mirror, gauging her emotional state. "You know what, Emma? I'm so proud of you already. Do you know that?" Emma shook her head, her eyes fixed on Mr. Flopsy's button nose. "I am," Susan continued firmly. Because it takes a really, really brave person to do what you're doing. And you are brave. You're my brave girl. As they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Emma's anxiety spiked dramatically. The building was enormous, an imposing structure of gray stone and glass that looked like a fortress. American flags hung from the entrance. Police cars were parked in designated spaces. Officers in uniforms moved about with purpose and authority. Emma's breathing became shallow, and she gripped Mr. Flopsy so hard her little knuckles turned white. "I don't want to go in," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mommy, please, I'm too scared." Susan's heart ached, but before she could respond, something extraordinary happened. A police car pulled up directly beside them in the parking lot. Its lights weren't flashing, and there was no siren, but its presence was unmistakable. From the driver's seat emerged Officer James Martinez, a man in his late 30s with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a physique that suggested years of disciplined training. He wore the navy blue uniform of the Denver Police Department with pride, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. But what immediately caught Emma's attention wasn't the officer himself. It was the creature walking beside him. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything so beautiful, so majestic, so utterly captivating in her entire 3 years of life. Officer Duke was a German shepherd of extraordinary proportions, not large in a threatening way, but powerfully built with perfect musculature that spoke of rigorous training. His coat was a stunning jet black color with rich tan markings on his legs, chest, and above his eyes. His ears were perfectly erect and alert, constantly moving to capture sounds. But it was his eyes that truly mesmerized Emma. They were a brilliant amber color, intelligent and kind, with an almost human-like understanding radiating from them. Susan unbuckled Emma from her car seat and lifted her out, setting her on the pavement. Emma stood frozen, her eyes locked on Duke, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Officer Martinez approached with a warm, knowing smile. He had done this many times before, brought comfort animals to anxious child witnesses, and he could read Emma's reaction perfectly. "Well, hello there," Martinez said in a gentle, soothing voice that somehow made the enormous courthouse behind him seem less intimidating. He knelt down to Emma's level, his movements slow and deliberate, non-threatening. "Are you Emma?" Emma managed a tiny nod, still unable to tear her gaze away from the magnificent dog beside the officer. "Emma, my name is Officer James Martinez, and I want you to meet someone very, very special." He paused for effect, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "This is Officer Duke. Duke is a police dog, and he's one of the bravest, smartest, most wonderful dogs in the entire state of Colorado." Duke, as if on cue, took a step toward Emma. The dog moved with perfect grace, his tail wagging gently in a slow, controlled rhythm. His head tilted slightly, and those intelligent amber eyes focused entirely on the small girl before him. There was no aggression, no threat, no judgment, only a kind of peaceful understanding that seemed to transcend species and age. "Duke has been waiting all morning to meet you," Officer Martinez continued. "You know why? Because Duke has a very special job. His job is to help children like you when they're feeling scared or worried. Duke knows how to make people feel brave, and I have a feeling that Duke thinks you're going to be one of the bravest people he's ever met." Emma's lower lip trembled. Tears began to form in her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear this time. They were tears of connection, of recognition, of something deeper that even a 3-year-old could feel. She reached out one small, tentative hand toward Duke. The dog immediately responded, stepping closer and gently pressing his nose into Emma's outstretched palm. The sensation was electric. Emma felt the warmth of Duke's fur, the softness of his nose, and something inexplicable happened in that moment. It was as if all her fear, all her anxiety, all her trauma regarding what she had witnessed drained out of her body and into the earth beneath her feet. Duke's presence was like a balm, a healing force, a silent promise that everything would be okay. "He's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "He is," Officer Martinez agreed. "And he's going to be right beside you today, okay? Wherever you go, Duke goes. He's going to be your friend, your protector, and your reminder that you're safe and brave." Emma looked up at Officer Martinez, then at her mother, then back at Duke. The dog's tail wagged faster, as if he understood that this moment marked a turning point. As they began walking toward the courthouse entrance, with Duke positioned right beside Emma and Officer Martinez on her other side, something had fundamentally shifted. Emma was still scared, terrified actually, but she was no longer alone. She had an ally, a partner, a four-legged warrior who would stand beside her as she faced the most important challenge of her young life. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all, but as Emma's small hand reached up to touch Duke's fur again, she felt a surge of courage she didn't know she possessed. Emma's small hand gripped the fabric of Officer Martinez's jacket with such intensity that her little knuckles had turned white. Her fingers clenched and unclenched rhythmically, a nervous habit that had developed over the past few weeks as anticipation for this day built. On her other side, Duke walked with perfect obedience, his leash held loosely in Officer Martinez's other hand. The dog's presence was grounding, reassuring, and Emma found herself stealing frequent glances at him, drawing strength from his calm, unwavering demeanor. They stood before the massive glass doors of the Denver County Courthouse, a building so imposing that Emma had to crane her neck backward just to see the top of it. "Ready?" Officer Martinez asked gently, squeezing Emma's hand softly. Emma wasn't ready, not even close. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a frightened bird trapped in a cage. Her palms were clammy with sweat. Her throat felt dry and tight. But she looked at Duke, at the dog's strong profile, at the absolute confidence radiating from him, and she managed a shaky nod. The glass doors slid open automatically with a mechanical whoosh, and the temperature dropped immediately. The courthouse lobby was aggressively air-conditioned, cold enough that Emma could see goosebumps rising on her bare arms. The space was vast and echoing, with soaring ceilings that made her feel impossibly small. Her sneakers, white with pink laces, clicked against the polished marble floor as they walked, the sound amplified by the acoustics of the enormous room. There were people everywhere: police officers, lawyers in expensive suits, security guards, court employees, and various civilians waiting for their cases to be called. Emma felt every single eye turn toward them as they crossed the lobby. The presence of a police dog was unusual enough to warrant attention, but a tiny 3-year-old girl walking between a police officer and a German shepherd was unusual enough to make people stop and stare. Emma felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and she wished she could become invisible. The whispering started immediately, hushed conversations that she could just barely hear. "Is that a child witness?" someone murmured. "With a comfort animal, that must be serious," another voice replied. Susan, who was walking just behind them, placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma glanced back at her mother and received an encouraging smile, though she could see the worry lines etched around Susan's eyes. Her mother was scared too, Emma realized. That revelation somehow made Emma feel slightly less alone in her terror. They approached the security checkpoint, a gauntlet of metal detectors and X-ray machines staffed by serious-looking security officers. Officer Martinez showed his badge and identification, explaining that Duke was a certified police dog and comfort animal for a court proceeding. One of the security officers, a woman with kind eyes and gray streaked through her dark hair, bent down to Emma's level. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said warmly. "I'm going to need to scan Officer Duke and Officer Martinez, but you're going to walk right through with your mom, okay? You're going to go through that machine and it's going to beep a little bit, but that's totally normal. Nothing scary. It just takes a picture to make sure everyone is safe." Emma nodded solemnly, trying to process these instructions. Her mother gently guided her toward the metal detector. As they passed through, the machine beeped loudly, a sharp electronic sound that made Emma jump and grab her mother's hand tighter. but it was over in an instant, and they had made it through safely. On the other side of security, Officer Martinez waited with Duke, who had been cleared without issue. The security officer smiled at Emma as she passed. "You're doing great, brave girl," she said. "Really great." They began walking down a long hallway lined with closed wooden doors. Brass plaques on each door indicated various courtrooms: District Courtroom A, District Courtroom B, Family Court, Criminal Court. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, clip-clop, clip-clop, the rhythmic sound of Emma's sneakers alternating with the softer padding of Duke's paws on the marble floor. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and Emma had the disorienting sensation of being trapped in some kind of maze. Other people passed them in the hallway. A woman in a business suit talking frantically on her cell phone. A man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. An elderly couple holding hands looking worried. A group of court officers in uniform. Every single person seemed to notice Emma, seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen. The weight of their attention was suffocating. "How much further?" Emma whispered to Officer Martinez, her voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Not far now," he assured her. "Just a little bit further, and then we're going to meet some very nice people who are going to help us make sure Shadow gets taken care of okay." The mention of Shadow's name made Emma's chest tight. Shadow, the suffering dog next door. The reason she was doing this terrifying thing. The reason her nightmares had become her constant companion. Emma thought about those hollow eyes, that skeletal frame, that desperate whimpering that haunted her dreams. The thought of Shadow gave her a tiny spark of courage. They reached the end of the hallway, and Officer Martinez gently pulled open a heavy wooden door marked Criminal Courtroom 3. The space beyond was absolutely intimidating. The courtroom was enormous, with dark wood paneling covering the walls from floor to ceiling. A large American flag stood in one corner, and the state flag in another. The judge's bench was elevated high above everything else, an imposing platform of dark wood, where the judge sat in his black robes, looking down at everyone else like some kind of all-powerful deity. The jury box was on the left side, with 12 empty chairs waiting to be filled. The gallery where observers sat was on the right, with rows of wooden benches that were already occupied by various people. Reporters with notepads, concerned citizens, and most importantly, Emma could see her neighbor, Mr. David Peterson, sitting at the defense table. He looked angry, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold and hard. When his gaze landed on Emma, she felt a chill run down her spine. This was real. This was actually happening. A woman in professional attire approached them, the prosecutor, Ms. Catherine Richardson. She was tall, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Emma, I'm Ms. Richardson. I'm so glad you're here. I know this is scary, but you're going to be amazing, okay?" Emma didn't feel amazing. She felt like she was going to throw up. Ms. Richardson gestured toward the witness stand, a wooden chair elevated on a platform, positioned directly in front of the judge and facing the jury. From that chair, Emma would be visible to everyone in the courtroom. Everyone would be staring at her. Everyone would be listening to her every word. The thought made her knees weak. Officer Martinez guided Emma toward the witness stand. As they walked, he positioned Duke perfectly so that the dog would be right beside the chair where Emma would sit. The bailiff, a stern-looking man with a badge, nodded at Officer Martinez, understanding the protocol. This wasn't his first rodeo with a child witness and a comfort animal. Emma climbed the small wooden steps to the witness stand. The chair was much higher than she expected, and when she sat down, her feet dangled in the air, swinging several inches above the floor. She felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable, utterly alone, except for the fact that Duke rested his chin on the armrest right beside her, his solid, warm, reassuring presence keeping her tethered to reality. The bailiff approached with a Bible. "Emma, I'm going to ask you to put your hand on this book and tell the truth. Do you understand?" Emma placed her tiny hand on the Bible, which felt enormous beneath her palm. She could feel the texture of the leather binding, the weight of tradition and importance. This was the moment. This was when her words would begin to matter. This was when she would have to speak about the worst thing she had ever seen. She looked at Duke. The dog's eyes met hers, filled with quiet confidence and unwavering support. In that moment, Emma understood that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had a warrior beside her, a protector, a friend who believed in her completely. The bailiff began to speak, but Emma's focus remained on Duke, drawing courage from his silent strength, preparing herself to speak truth into the courtroom, preparing herself to save Shadow's life. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom as he administered the oath to Emma. "Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" His words seemed to hang in the air like a solemn pronouncement, the weight of judicial tradition pressing down on the small shoulders of a 3-year-old girl who could barely reach the armrest of the witness chair. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper, I do." The courtroom settled into an expectant silence. Judge Harold Richardson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, adjusted his reading glasses and studied Emma with a mixture of concern and determination. He had presided over countless cases in his 30 years on the bench, but child witnesses always presented a unique challenge. He had approved the use of Officer Duke specifically because he understood that Emma's testimony could be crucial to this case. Prosecutor Ms. Catherine Richardson approached the witness stand with measured, careful steps. She carried no papers, no notes. She had practiced this examination countless times. She knew that if she seemed too formal, too aggressive, Emma would shut down. The little girl needed to feel safe, supported, and encouraged to speak her truth. Ms. Richardson positioned herself to the side of the witness stand, deliberately keeping a non-threatening distance, and offered Emma the warmest smile she could muster. "Emma, thank you so much for being here today," Ms. Richardson began, her voice gentle and encouraging. "I know this is a big, scary room with a lot of people, but I want you to know that you're doing something really important. Do you understand?" Emma nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on Duke's steady gaze. The dog had positioned himself perfectly, close enough that Emma could feel his warmth radiating against the side of the chair, but not so close that he would distract from her testimony. Officer Martinez stood nearby, his hand resting lightly on Duke's leash, ready to manage the dog if needed, though he had trained Duke so well that the dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "Emma, I want to ask you some questions about something you saw," Ms. Richardson continued. "Can you tell me what you saw at your neighbor's house?" This was it. This was the moment Emma had been dreading and dreading simultaneously. All her nightmares, all her anxiety, all her fear came down to this single moment when she would have to put into words the horror she had witnessed. Emma's small hands trembled in her lap. Her throat felt tight and dry. She wanted to cry, wanted to run away, wanted to disappear into the floor. But then she felt it, the gentle pressure of Duke's muzzle against her leg, through the fabric of her pink dress. The dog wasn't pushing hard, wasn't being intrusive, just a subtle reminder that he was there, that he believed in her, that she wasn't alone. I saw a doggy," Emma began, her voice barely audible. She had to pause and swallow hard, fighting against the lump forming in her throat. "At Mr. Peterson's house, behind the fence." "What was the dog's name?" Ms. Richardson asked gently. "Shadow," Emma whispered. "His name is Shadow." "Can you tell us what Shadow looked like?" And then something miraculous happened. As Emma began to speak, her voice grew stronger. The words started coming faster, more confidently. It was as if giving voice to what she had witnessed somehow made it real in a way that her nightmares couldn't. She was controlling the narrative now, not the other way around. "Shadow is a big golden dog," Emma said, her childlike description somehow more powerful than any expert testimony. "But he's not healthy big, he's skinny big, like his bones are too big for his skin. I could see all of his ribs, like every single one. They were sticking out like this." Emma held up her tiny hand and pressed her fingers together, trying to demonstrate the skeletal appearance of the neglected animal. Several jurors leaned forward, completely captivated by the innocent honesty of a 3-year-old describing animal cruelty. One older gentleman in the jury box had tears streaming down his face. His fur was all dirty and matted, Emma continued, her words tumbling out now in a rush. It was supposed to be golden and pretty, but it was all brown and gross and clumpy, and it smelled bad, like poop and pee and old food. I could smell it from the fence. Ms. Richardson let Emma talk, knowing that the raw, unfiltered observations of a child were far more powerful than any leading questions she could ask. Emma described Shadow's living conditions with devastating detail. The chain so short that the dog could barely move more than a few feet in any direction, the lack of shelter, the absence of food and water bowls, the way Shadow's collar had become embedded in his fur from the constant pressure. One time, Emma said, her voice breaking slightly, I saw that his collar was bleeding. There was red on his neck and the chain was really tight and he was crying. He was making these sounds like he was hurt, and Mr. Peterson just looked at him and laughed. He laughed at Shadow when Shadow was hurting. Defense attorney Mr. Harrison, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, suddenly shifted in his seat. He leaned over to whisper something to his client, Mr. Peterson, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard the accusation, had seen the raw emotion in Emma's eyes as she described witnessing someone finding amusement in animal suffering. How many times did you see Shadow like this? Ms. Richardson asked. A lot of times, Emma replied. Every day when I played outside, he was always there, and he was always sad, and he was always crying. Emma, did Shadow ever have water to drink that you could see? Emma shook her head vigorously. No, the water bowl was there, but it was always empty. Sometimes it had dirt in it or bugs. One time it had green stuff growing in it. Shadow would try to drink from it, but there was nothing. He was so thirsty. I could tell because his tongue was all hanging out and it looked like it was dry. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the judge, who had seen countless cases of human-on-human crime, seemed visibly moved by the testimony of a toddler describing the systematic neglect of an innocent animal. Ms. Richardson asked a few more questions, establishing the timeline of when Emma had witnessed these conditions, how often she had observed Shadow in this state, and whether she was certain about what she had seen. I know what I saw, Emma said firmly, her voice taking on an unexpected strength. I see Shadow every day. I know him. He's nice. He's just sad because Mr. Peterson is mean to him. When Ms. Richardson finished her examination, she squeezed Emma's shoulder gently and returned to her seat. The judge looked at the defense attorney. Mr. Harrison, do you wish to cross-examine? This was the moment Emma's mother had been dreading. This was when the defense would try to discredit Emma's testimony, when they would attempt to make her doubt herself, when they would employ whatever tactics they could to minimize the impact of her words. Mr. Harrison rose from his seat and approached the witness stand with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He clearly believed that cross-examining a 3-year-old would be simple, that he could easily poke holes in her story, that a child's perception couldn't possibly withstand legal scrutiny. Emma, he began in a patronizing tone that made several jurors visibly bristle, you're a very young girl, aren't you? I'm 3, Emma said simply. And 3-year-olds have very big imaginations, don't they? Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at Duke, and the dog tilted his head, his amber eyes never leaving her face. It was a subtle gesture, but it seemed to fortify Emma's resolve. My imagination is for pretend, Emma said with surprising clarity for her age. But Shadow is real, and what I saw was real. I don't pretend about that. Mr. Harrison's jaw tightened. He tried a different approach. You're saying my client, Mr. Peterson, was mean to the dog, but couldn't Shadow have just been sick? Couldn't he have just been a naturally thin dog? No, Emma said firmly, because other dogs aren't like that. Duke is a dog and he's healthy and strong. Shadow was like if you didn't eat for a really long time, like you'd get all bony and sick. The jurors exchanged meaningful glances. Emma's comparison was simple but devastatingly effective. She was describing malnutrition in a way that transcended courtroom language. Mr. Harrison pressed further, asking Emma leading questions designed to confuse her or make her second-guess herself. But each time, Emma returned to the same simple, unshakable truth. She had seen Shadow suffering. She had witnessed neglect. She knew the difference between a healthy dog and a suffering one because she could see it with her own eyes and feel it in her heart. After nearly 40 minutes of cross-examination, Mr. Harrison finally gave up, frustrated and clearly realizing that attacking a 3-year-old on the witness stand was not going to win him any points with the jury. He returned to his seat, defeated. Judge Richardson looked at Emma with something approaching admiration. "You may step down, Emma. Thank you for your courage." As Emma climbed down from the witness stand, Duke pressed against her leg, and Officer Martinez guided them both back to the gallery where Susan sat with tears streaming down her face. Emma had done it. She had told her truth. She had spoken for the voiceless. And in doing so, she had changed everything. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Criminal Court Room 3, casting long shadows across the wooden benches and the polished floor. After lunch recess, the courtroom had reconvened, and the energy had shifted dramatically. Emma sat in the gallery beside her mother, her small body tucked protectively against Susan's side. Officer Duke lay on the floor beside the bench, his head resting on his paws, seemingly at peace despite the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Officer Martinez stood nearby, observing everything with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading courtrooms and juries. The afternoon session had begun with additional testimony from animal control officers and veterinarians who had examined Shadow after the police intervention. Their clinical descriptions of the dog's condition, severe malnutrition, infected collar wounds, behavioral trauma consistent with prolonged neglect, had been important but somewhat sterile. Numbers and medical terminology could be easily dismissed or minimized by a skilled defense attorney. But Emma's testimony, raw, honest, and emotionally resonant, had planted seeds in the jurors' minds that refused to be uprooted. Now, as the day wore on toward 4 p.m., something unexpected happened. The prosecutor approached Judge Richardson with a whispered request. The judge's eyebrows rose, and he nodded slowly. Ms. Richardson had asked for permission to recall Emma to the stand for additional testimony, something unusual but not unheard of. The judge granted the request, and the bailiff called Emma's name once more. Susan's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "Just tell the truth like you did before." Emma walked back toward the witness stand on unsteady legs, her pink dress swishing softly with each step. Officer Martinez positioned Duke beside the chair once more, and Emma climbed up and settled into the oversized seat, her feet dangling helplessly in the air. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Mr. Peterson seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. His jaw clenched, and he exchanged a worried glance with his defense attorney. Ms. Richardson approached the witness stand, and this time her expression was different. Instead of the careful, nurturing demeanor she had displayed that morning, there was now a fire in her eyes, a determination to push Emma just far enough to access the deepest truth she carried within her. "Emma, I have just a few more questions for you," Ms. Richardson began. "When you looked at Shadow, when you saw how he was living, how did that make you feel?" Emma's lower lip began to tremble immediately. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her lap, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The courtroom waited, barely breathing. "It made me very sad," Emma whispered. "It made me feel like my heart was breaking into pieces." Several jurors wiped their eyes. Ms. Richardson took a step closer to the witness stand. "Emma, I want you to think very carefully about what I'm going to ask you. You've been very brave today. Can you think about Shadow one more time? Can you picture him in your mind?" Emma nodded slowly, though her whole body seemed to be trembling now. "When you looked into Shadow's eyes," Ms. Richardson continued, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "what did you see there?" This was the moment. This was the question that would either fall flat or soar into the realm of legendary testimony. Emma sat silently for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Her 3-year-old mind was accessing something deeper than language, something more profound than words could typically capture. She was reaching into her intuitive understanding of animals, her innate ability to read emotional states through nonverbal communication. Then slowly, Emma lifted her eyes. Her gaze moved across the courtroom, taking in the judge, the jury, the court officers, and finally landing on Officer Duke, who had risen to his feet and placed his chin on the armrest beside her once more. Emma's hand reached out and touched Duke's head, her small fingers burying themselves in his soft fur. And then she spoke words that would be quoted, recorded, analyzed, and remembered for years to come. "Dogs talk with their eyes. Duke's eyes tell me he's proud of me and that he knows I'm telling the truth. Duke's eyes tell me he's strong and brave and good. But Shadow's eyes—" Emma paused, struggling with the enormity of what she was about to say. "Shadow's eyes told me he was dying. They were dark and sad and scared all the time. His eyes told me that nobody was helping him. His eyes told me that he was in pain. His eyes told me that he wanted to die because living hurt too much." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in that distinctive sound of collective emotional release, gasps, sobs, the scraping of chairs as people adjusted their positions to process what they had just heard. One juror, a woman in her 50s with gray hair, buried her face in her hands. Another juror, an older man with weathered features, stared straight ahead, tears streaming down his face. Even Judge Richardson removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes, taking a moment to compose himself. Mr. Harrison stood up, his face flushed with anger or desperation. It was hard to tell which. "Objection. The witness is speculating. A 3-year-old cannot possibly interpret animal behavior with that level of sophistication." But his objection fell on deaf ears. Judge Richardson held up his hand, silencing the defense attorney. "Overruled. The witness has been consistent in her observations throughout her testimony. Please continue, Ms. Richardson." The prosecutor, sensing that she had struck gold, decided to press forward with just one more question, the one that would seal everything. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important," Ms. Richardson said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Why did you come here today? Why did you decide to be so brave and tell all these people about what you saw?" Emma looked directly at Shadow's absence, at the empty space where the dog should have been, at the injustice that had driven her to speak despite her terror. Duke pressed his body closer to her chair, and Emma seemed to draw infinite strength from that contact. "Because Shadow can't talk," Emma said with a clarity that belied her 3 years. "Because nobody was listening to Shadow's eyes, because if I don't tell, he's going to die. And that's not fair. Dogs are good. They love people even when people are mean to them. Shadow didn't do anything wrong. He just wanted food and water and love, and that's not too much to ask." The silence that followed was absolute and complete. It was the silence of a room that had just witnessed something transcendent, something that transcended the mundane procedures of the legal system and touched something sacred and primal, the bond between humans and animals, the responsibility of the strong to protect the weak, the power of a child's voice to speak truth that adults had been unable to articulate. Defense attorney Mr. Harrison rose once more to attempt a cross-examination, but Judge Richardson stopped him with a raised hand. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think further questioning at this point would be productive or, frankly, appropriate." He looked at Emma, and his aged eyes held something that looked remarkably like respect. "Emma, you may step down. Thank you for your service to this court." As Emma descended from the witness stand, she collapsed into her mother's arms, her body finally allowing the stress and emotion she had been holding to release itself in a torrent of tears. But they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of relief, of completion, of having finally accomplished something monumentally important. Officer Martinez brought Duke over, and the dog gently rested his head on Emma's lap, providing comfort to the child who had just spoken truth to power. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with emotion and realization. Everyone understood that the trial's outcome had just been decided by a 3-year-old girl and a police dog. The judge looked at both attorneys. The court will now recess for 15 minutes before closing arguments. As the judge exited the courtroom, Ms. Richardson approached Emma and knelt down beside her. "Emma, you were absolutely extraordinary. Do you understand what you just did? You didn't just testify, you changed people's hearts." Emma, nestled against her mother and Duke, simply nodded. She didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she had accomplished, but somehow, deep in her bones, she knew that Shadow would be okay now. She knew that her voice had mattered. She knew that love and courage and truth were more powerful than cruelty and neglect. The courtroom doors burst open as the afternoon recess ended, and people began filing back in for the closing arguments. But something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The energy that had been present that morning, adversarial, combative, uncertain, had been replaced by something more resolute, more purposeful. The jurors took their seats with different postures than before. Where some had sat with crossed arms and skeptical expressions during the morning session, they now sat forward, engaged, their eyes reflecting the weight of what they had just witnessed. Emma remained in the gallery with her mother, Duke positioned protectively at her feet. Officer Martinez stood nearby, and he leaned down to whisper something to Susan. "Your daughter is an extraordinary human being. In 15 years of doing this work, I have never seen a child access that level of emotional intelligence and articulation. She didn't just testify. She fundamentally altered the consciousness of everyone in this room." Susan couldn't respond. She was too busy processing her own emotions, pride, relief, lingering anxiety about what would come next. She kept her hand on Emma's shoulder, anchoring her daughter, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this overwhelming space filled with adults making life-altering decisions. The prosecutor, Ms. Catherine Richardson, stood for her closing argument. But before she launched into her prepared remarks, she did something unusual. She walked directly to where Emma sat in the gallery and looked at the little girl for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, she simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Emma felt her cheeks warm, and she buried her face in her mother's shoulder, embarrassed by the attention, but also somehow understanding the significance of that silent acknowledgement. "Members of the jury," Ms. Richardson began, her voice carrying the weight of everything she was about to say, "you have heard testimony today from animal control officers, from veterinarians, from neighbors, and from a 3-year-old child. Each of these witnesses provided you with crucial information about the condition of an animal named Shadow and the systematic neglect inflicted upon that animal by the defendant, David Peterson." She paused, letting her words settle into the minds of the jurors. "But I want to focus on the testimony you heard from Emma Chen. This child, barely 3 years old, demonstrated a level of honesty, clarity, and moral courage that many adults would struggle to achieve. She came to this courtroom terrified. Her mother told me that she has been having nightmares for weeks, plagued by the memory of an animal's suffering. Yet she chose to walk into this room, to face the person who caused that suffering, and to speak her truth." Ms. Richardson walked slowly across the front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as she passed. "When Emma told you that dogs talk with their eyes, she wasn't being poetic or imaginative. She was speaking from a place of profound understanding about animal consciousness and suffering. She was translating something that animals cannot express in human language: their pain, their terror, their desperate need for care and compassion. And she did it with a clarity and honesty that no expert witness could replicate." In the jury box, several jurors were openly crying now. The woman who had buried her face in her hands earlier was still wiping her eyes. The older gentleman who had wept during Emma's initial testimony was staring directly ahead, his jaw clenched with emotion. The defendant would have you believe that this child is too young to understand what she saw, that her observations are unreliable, that her perception is tainted by imagination. But I ask you, which is more reliable, a child's innocent, unfiltered observation of reality, or an adult's calculated attempt to minimize and justify animal cruelty? Ms. Richardson's closing argument lasted 40 minutes, but every word seemed to build on the foundation that Emma's testimony had established. She presented the veterinary evidence, the animal control documentation, the photographs of Shadow's living conditions. But she continually circled back to Emma's words, to that profound statement about reading emotion in an animal's eyes. When Ms. Richardson finished, Mr. Harrison stood for his closing argument. But he seemed diminished, deflated, aware that he was fighting against something that transcended legal procedure. He attempted to discredit Emma's testimony by emphasizing her age, by suggesting that her perceptions could be misinterpreted, by trying to convince the jury that Shadow might have simply been a naturally thin dog with behavioral issues unrelated to neglect. But his words fell flat. The jurors barely seemed to be listening. Instead, they kept glancing at Emma, sitting quietly in the gallery, her small body radiating a kind of quiet dignity and moral clarity that no legal argument could overcome. Judge Richardson provided his instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards for animal cruelty, the burden of proof, the elements that needed to be established for a guilty verdict. Then the jury was led away to deliberate, and the courtroom settled into an anxious waiting period. Emma's mother took her daughter to a small consultation room off the main courtroom, a space that the judge had graciously made available. Officer Martinez brought Duke to join them, and the dog immediately curled up on the floor beside Emma, providing comfort through his mere presence. Susan ordered sandwiches from a nearby deli, though none of them had much appetite. The waiting was almost worse than the testimony itself. The uncertainty, the not knowing, the fear that despite everything Emma had said, the jury might still vote to acquit. 3 hours passed, then 4. As the afternoon stretched into evening, people began to wonder if the jury would reach a verdict that day at all. Sometimes, when cases were complex or emotions were high, juries deliberated for days. But at 5:47 p.m., the bailiff emerged from the jury deliberation room and announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom. Emma was brought back to her seat in the gallery, and she gripped Officer Martinez's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The jurors filed back in, and their expressions told the story before a single word was spoken. They looked solemn but resolute. Several of them glanced at Emma, and one juror, the older gentleman who had cried during her testimony, actually made direct eye contact with the little girl and nodded slightly as if to say, "We heard you. We believed you. We did the right thing." The judge asked the jurors if they had reached a verdict. The jury foreman, a woman in her 60s with kind features, stood and handed a form to the bailiff. The judge opened it, read it silently, and his expression remained neutral, but Emma could have sworn she saw the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "On the charge of animal cruelty, first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty," the jury foreman said firmly. "On the charge of animal cruelty, second degree." "Guilty." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a kind of collective exhalation of relief and validation. Emma's mother pulled her daughter into her arms, and tears streamed down Susan's face. Officer Martinez allowed a rare smile to cross his usually stoic features, and Duke, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment, stood and gently placed his paws on Emma's lap, offering his own form of celebration. As court officers led a visibly shocked and enraged Mr. Peterson away, Ms. Richardson approached Emma and her mother. "You did it," she said simply. "Your daughter did it. Shadow is going to be okay now." The reality of those words, "Shadow is going to be okay," hit Emma like a wave. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the nightmares had been worth it. The dog she had seen suffering, the animal whose eyes had haunted her dreams, would now receive care, would now be loved, would now have a chance at happiness. That night, as Emma lay in bed at home, she slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. No nightmares, no desperate whimpering in her dreams, just the peaceful sleep of a child who had done something extraordinarily important and had helped save a life. Officer Martinez sent a message to Susan. "Emma should know that Shadow has already been examined by our rescue partners. Despite his condition, he's going to make a full recovery, and that's entirely because of your daughter's courage." 3 weeks had passed since the verdict, and the world had continued turning, indifferent to the monumental shift that had occurred in the lives of one small girl, one police dog, and one suffering animal. Emma had returned to her normal routine, preschool, playdates, bedtime stories, but she was fundamentally changed by the experience. She no longer woke up screaming in the middle of the night. The darkness that had consumed her psychological landscape had gradually receded, replaced by a growing sense of purpose, an understanding that her voice mattered, that her observations had value, that speaking truth could create tangible change in the world. The day before the sentencing hearing, Officer Martinez had called Susan with important news. "I wanted you to know that Shadow has been transferred to the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue Center in Colorado Springs. The veterinarians there have begun his rehabilitation, and the prognosis is excellent. He's eating well, responding to treatment, and most importantly, his behavioral issues are improving as he realizes he's safe." Susan relayed this information to Emma, and the little girl had asked the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "When can I see Shadow?" "Maybe soon," Susan had promised, though she wasn't entirely sure that would be possible. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold December morning, the kind of morning when Denver's breath seemed to freeze in the air. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, animal welfare advocates, curious citizens, and people who had followed the case through news reports. Emma was present once more, though this time her role was not to testify, but to witness justice being formally administered. Judge Richardson entered the courtroom with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. He carried the pre-sentencing investigation report, documents that would inform his decision regarding David Peterson's punishment. The judge had clearly taken the case to heart. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor serious, and there was an unmistakable undercurrent of moral conviction in his bearing. "David Peterson," the judge began, addressing the defendant directly, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 2 counts of animal cruelty. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to speak directly to you about what this case represents." Judge Richardson leaned forward, his aged eyes boring into the defendant's face with the force of judicial authority and moral disapproval. "In my 30 years on this bench, I have presided over countless cases involving human-on-human crime, but I want you to know that animal cruelty, systematic, prolonged animal cruelty, represents something fundamentally evil about a human being. It demonstrates a profound lack of empathy, a willingness to inflict suffering on a creature that depends entirely on human compassion for its survival." The courtroom was absolutely silent. The evidence presented in this case was compelling. The veterinary testimony was damning. But what I will never forget, what will stay with me for the rest of my life, is the testimony of a 3-year-old child who demonstrated more moral clarity, more emotional intelligence, and more courage than many adults I have encountered in my judicial career. Judge Richardson's gaze shifted to Emma, sitting in the gallery with her mother's arm around her shoulders. The judge nodded slightly, a gesture of profound respect, before returning his attention to the defendant. Emma Chen came to this courtroom terrified. She had been having nightmares about your cruelty toward your animal. Yet she spoke truth with a clarity and honesty that moved this entire courtroom. She taught us all something about the interconnectedness of all living beings, about the responsibility we have to protect those who cannot protect themselves. David Peterson's face had turned white. He seemed to understand that whatever compassion or leniency he might have hoped for was evaporating before his eyes. Therefore, Judge Richardson continued, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, I sentence you as follows: 18 months in the Colorado Department of Corrections, a fine of $50,000, mandatory completion of an animal welfare education program, and a permanent prohibition on owning, possessing, or having authority over any animal for the remainder of your life. Additionally, I am awarding restitution to the Animal Rescue Organization that will be caring for the victim animal, in the amount of $10,000 for veterinary care and rehabilitation. The courtroom erupted. Applause broke out, something unusual and technically improper in a courtroom setting, but Judge Richardson did not strike his gavel to silence it. He simply watched, allowing the moment to breathe, allowing people to express the emotional catharsis of witnessing justice served in a case that had moved so many hearts. As court officers led David Peterson away in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and desperation, Emma felt a strange mixture of emotions. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. She had never wanted to cause suffering, even to the person who had caused Shadow's suffering. But she also understood in some deep, primal way that consequences mattered, that actions had repercussions, that cruelty could not exist without being addressed. After the sentencing concluded, Ms. Richardson approached Emma and her mother once more. I have something for you, the prosecutor said, smiling warmly. She handed Susan a folder containing official documents and photographs. These are updates from the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue Center. Shadow has been making remarkable progress. The veterinarians estimate that within 2 months he will be fully recovered and ready for adoption. Susan opened the folder and gasped softly. Inside were photographs of Shadow, the same dog Emma had witnessed suffering but transformed. In these pictures, the dog's coat was beginning to grow back in its proper golden color. His ribs were no longer visible. His eyes, those eyes that Emma had learned to read so clearly, were bright and alert, filled with something that looked remarkably like hope. There's something else, Ms. Richardson continued. She pulled out another document. The case has attracted significant attention from animal welfare advocates. There's a movement forming to create stronger animal protection laws here in Colorado, and they're calling it Emma's Law. They want to increase penalties for animal cruelty and create more robust protections for animals in situations like Shadow's. Emma's mother looked down at her daughter, and tears began streaming down her face. Do you hear that, Emma? They're nomming a law after you. Because of what you said, because of your bravery, animals are going to be protected better than they ever were before. Emma didn't fully understand the magnitude of what her mother was saying, but she understood the essential truth. Her voice had created waves that would extend far beyond her own life, far beyond Shadow's individual case. She had sparked something, ignited a movement, contributed to systemic change. Officer Martinez arrived with Duke just as they were leaving the courtroom. The dog immediately bounded toward Emma, his tail wagging with enthusiastic recognition. Emma knelt down and wrapped her arms around Duke's neck, burying her face in his soft fur. I have news for you, Officer Martinez said, smiling broadly. The director of the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue Center heard about Emma's case and asked if you would like to visit Shadow. They want to introduce you properly, to let you see firsthand how much he's improved. Would you like that, Emma? Emma's eyes went wide. Really? Can I see Shadow? This weekend, Officer Martinez confirmed. You, your mom, Duke, and me, we're all going to drive down to Colorado Springs. You're going to meet Shadow face to face, and he's going to thank you in the only way he knows how. That night, Emma lay in bed unable to sleep, but not from nightmares. She was awake with anticipation, with excitement, with the overwhelming joy of knowing that in just a few days, She would see the dog whose suffering had changed her life forever. She thought about Shadow's eyes, about the profound sadness she had witnessed in them, about the transformation that was occurring as the dog received proper care and love. She thought about the chain that had bound him, now severed. She thought about the empty food bowls, now filled with nutritious meals. She thought about the solitary confinement of that backyard, soon to be replaced by the nurturing environment of a rescue center, and eventually, a loving forever home. And as Emma drifted off to sleep, a smile played across her lips. She had been terrified when she walked into that courtroom, but she had discovered something extraordinary about herself. She had the power to speak for the voiceless. She had the courage to stand against cruelty. She had the moral clarity to see injustice and refuse to accept it. Justice, she had learned, could move like lightning when enough people came together and spoke truth. And she, a 3-year-old girl with help from a police dog and the support of adults who believed in her, had been the catalyst for that lightning strike. The parking lot of the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue Center in Colorado Springs was bathed in golden December sunlight when Officer Martinez's police vehicle pulled in that Saturday morning. Emma pressed her face against the car window, her heart hammering with anticipation and a mixture of nervousness and excitement that made her entire body tingle. Beside her, Officer Duke sat alertly, his amber eyes tracking the landscape as they passed various buildings and outdoor enclosures where rescued animals recuperated and rehabilitation. "We're here," Officer Martinez announced, turning off the engine. He turned to look at Emma in the back seat, his expression warm and encouraging. "Are you ready to meet Shadow?" Emma nodded, but she couldn't find her voice. Her throat felt tight with emotion. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past 3 weeks, imagined what Shadow would look like, how he would react to seeing her, whether he would somehow understand that she was the girl who had spoken for him in that intimidating courtroom. Susan helped Emma out of the car, and Officer Martinez clipped Duke's leash to his collar. The rescue center's director, Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an obvious passion for animal welfare, was waiting for them at the entrance. She was flanked by 2 veterinary technicians in blue scrubs. "Emma," Dr. Sullivan exclaimed, kneeling down to the little girl's level. "I have heard so much about you. You are an absolute hero, do you know that? Because of your bravery, Shadow has gotten a second chance at life." Emma felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. She looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to see Shadow now?" Dr. Sullivan asked. "Yes," Emma whispered, though the word came out barely audible. Dr. Sullivan led them through the rescue center, past various kennels and outdoor enclosures. They passed other rescued dogs, a timid pit bull with scars on his body, a terrified chihuahua that flinched at loud noises, an elderly German shepherd missing part of his ear. Each animal told a story of suffering and survival, of humans choosing cruelty and other humans choosing compassion. The center smelled of antiseptic cleaner, dog food, and hay. Soft barking echoed through the corridors. Finally, they arrived at a special recovery wing, a climate-controlled facility where dogs receiving intensive medical treatment were housed. Dr. Sullivan stopped at a door marked Recovery Room 3 and paused before opening it. "Shadow has made remarkable progress," she explained, looking directly at Emma. "When he first arrived here, he was severely malnourished, his immune system was compromised, and he had significant behavioral issues related to his trauma. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't trust anyone. He would cower in the corner whenever someone approached." Emma's heart broke hearing this description of Shadow's psychological state. "But something changed about 2 weeks ago," Dr. Sullivan continued. "One of our staff members was reading a news article about your testimony, about how you spoke for Shadow in court, and we read that article to Shadow. I know that sounds strange, but sometimes animals respond to the energy and intention behind words, even if they don't understand the specific meaning. And when we told Shadow that a brave little girl had spoken for him, something shifted in him. He started eating better. He started trusting the staff members more. He started acting like an animal that believed he had a future worth living for. Dr. Sullivan opened the door, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. Shadow stood in the center of the room, a golden Labrador who was still noticeably thin but infinitely healthier than the skeletal creature Emma had witnessed chained to a post months ago. His coat was beginning to regain its lustrous golden color. His eyes were alert and bright, and when he saw Emma enter the room, something extraordinary happened. Shadow's entire body went rigid for a moment, as if he was processing something profound. Then, slowly, deliberately, he walked toward Emma. Not aggressively, not fearfully, but with purpose. Officer Duke remained perfectly still, somehow understanding that this moment belonged to Emma and Shadow alone. Shadow's nose came down to sniff Emma's face, and the little girl held perfectly still, allowing the dog to investigate her scent. Tears began streaming down Emma's face, not tears of fear or sadness, but tears of overwhelming emotion, of connection, of the profound realization that this dog somehow recognized her, somehow understood that she had been his voice when he had no voice of his own. "Shadow," Emma whispered, reaching up to touch his face tentatively. "Hi, Shadow, I'm sorry I couldn't help you faster, but you're okay now, you're going to be okay." Shadow's tail began to wag slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. He pressed his head against Emma's chest, and the little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his soft fur. This was the dog who had haunted her nightmares, whose suffering had consumed her psyche, whose eyes had taught her to read emotion and suffering and desperation. And now, against all odds, against all the trauma and pain, Shadow was alive. Shadow was healing. Shadow was here in her arms, his tail wagging with what looked remarkably like gratitude and love. Officer Martinez, standing nearby with Duke, had to look away for a moment. In his 15 years working with service dogs, he had witnessed many remarkable moments, but nothing quite matched the profound connection between this 3-year-old girl and this rescued dog. Susan stood beside Dr. Sullivan, both women crying openly as they witnessed the reunion that represented the culmination of Emma's journey, from witnessing cruelty to speaking truth to witnessing healing. "Shadow is going to make a full recovery," Dr. Sullivan said softly to Susan. "And we've already received adoption applications from families wanting to give him a forever home. He'll have choices, opportunities, a life filled with love instead of suffering." Over the next 2 hours, Emma spent time with Shadow, playing gently, learning to read his body language, understanding how this dog communicated affection and trust. Officer Duke joined them, and the 2 dogs, the police dog who had given Emma courage and the rescued dog who had received Emma's advocacy, interacted with obvious mutual respect. It was as if Duke recognized Shadow as a brother-in-arms, a fellow warrior in the battle against cruelty. Before they left, Dr. Sullivan presented Emma with a special gift, a photograph of Shadow professionally framed with an inscription that read, "To Emma Chen, the girl who gave me my voice back. Thank you for saving my life. Love, Shadow." The drive back to Denver was quieter than the drive down. Emma held the framed photograph close to her chest, staring at Shadow's image, processing the profound emotional journey she had experienced. Officer Martinez kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, occasionally catching her eye and nodding, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of understanding. 6 months later, on a warm June afternoon, Emma stood on the steps of the Denver County Courthouse beside Officer Duke. News cameras flashed, reporters called out questions, and a crowd had gathered to witness a special ceremony. The Denver Police Department was honoring Officer Duke for his exceptional work as a comfort animal in child witness cases. But more importantly, they were celebrating Emma's role in creating systemic change in animal protection laws. Colorado's new legislation, officially known as Emma's Law, had passed with overwhelming support in the state legislature. The law increased penalties for animal cruelty from misdemeanors to felonies in cases of severe neglect. It created mandatory reporting requirements for suspected animal abuse. It established funding for animal rescue organizations and veterinary care for rescued animals. And it included provisions for using comfort animals in courtroom proceedings involving child witnesses. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham herself presented Emma with an official certificate of recognition. "Emma Chen," the governor said, speaking directly to the little girl who stood on the courthouse steps in a new pink dress, her hand resting on Duke's head, "you are an extraordinary example of courage and compassion. Your voice has changed the lives of countless animals in our state. You are a true hero." Emma felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she also felt something deeper, a profound sense of purpose, of knowing that her actions had mattered, that her voice had echoed through the halls of power and created lasting change. Later that evening, as Emma lay in bed, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about Shadow's hollow eyes in that backyard, about her nightmares, about her terror walking into that courtroom, about the moment when she first met Officer Duke and felt courage flood into her small body. She thought about the jury's tears, the judge's validation, the sentencing, the reunion with Shadow. Most of all, she thought about the power of truth, the strength of compassion, and the extraordinary things that one small person could accomplish when they refused to stay silent about injustice. Years would pass, and Emma would grow up understanding more fully the significance of what she had accomplished. She would receive letters from children across America saying that her story had inspired them to speak up about things they had witnessed. She would learn that Shadow had been adopted by a loving family in Boulder, Colorado, and had become a therapy dog for children with trauma, continuing the legacy of healing and compassion that Emma had initiated. She would follow in the footsteps of Officer Martinez and become a lawyer specializing in animal protection law. But on that June evening, as a 4-year-old girl drifted off to sleep, she simply knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had given voice to the voiceless. She had spoken truth when silence would have been easier. She had refused to accept injustice, and in doing so, she had changed everything. And that knowledge, that profound understanding of her own power and potential, would shape the rest of her life. The little girl who had been terrified to walk into a courtroom had become a hero, not because she was extraordinary or special or different from other children, but simply because she had chosen to speak. She had chosen courage over fear. She had chosen compassion over indifference. She had chosen to be the voice for an animal that couldn't speak for itself. And in that simple choice, in that one act of moral clarity and bravery, she had created a ripple effect that would transform animal protection law in Colorado and inspire a national movement toward greater compassion and accountability. That was Emma's legacy. That was the power of a 3-year-old girl who learned to read the truth in a dog's eyes and refused to look away.